Picture this. It's February 8th, 1945, and we're deep in the icy, unforgiving waters off the coast of Norway. Far beneath the crashing waves, a terrifying game of cat and mouse is just about to kick off. We've got two massive machines of war, both prowling completely blind in the pitch black, and they are on a direct collision course for a totally unprecedented, impossibly high-stakes encounter.
Okay, let's dive into this explainer, because what we're looking at here is a literal historical first. Up until this freezing day in 1945, the idea of a submerged submarine hunting down and destroying another fully submerged submarine, well, it was practically unheard of. I mean, the technology back then was basically primitive by today's standards. They relied entirely on sound, pencil and paper math, and just raw gut instinct. The margin for error was exactly zero. But, this wasn't just some random, unlucky skirmish in the dark. No, this was a highly targeted interception.
You see, the German U-boat U-864 wasn't just out on a routine patrol. It was on a top-secret mission, and its destination was all the way in Japan. And the cargo? Honestly, it was borderline apocalyptic. Tucked inside that steel hull were the blueprints and actual technology to build Japanese Me-262 fighter jets, V-2 rockets, and, get this, possibly even nuclear weapon technology. The commander, Korvettenkaptein Ralph Raymond Wolfram, who was only on his second war patrol, by the way, absolutely knew the stakes. If U-864 actually reached Japan, it had the very real potential to completely rewrite the end of the war. But then, out of nowhere, disaster strikes. U-864 is pushing steadily through the sea when a massive, violent bang startles the entire crew. The giant diesel engines start to thump and just fiercely vibrate, shaking the entire submarine to its core. Wolfram immediately grabs the intercom, and you can just imagine the panic in his voice as he yells, "Report! Engine room, report!" While the engineer comes back with some terrifying news. An air compressor has suffered a critical malfunction, and it's severely damaged those absolutely vital diesel engines. In a split second, Wolfram realizes his grand mission to Japan is totally derailed. He has absolutely no choice but to turn around and limp back to the Norwegian coast for repairs. But here's the catch. Returning to port is insanely dangerous. He knows perfectly well that Allied submarines could be lurking anywhere in these waters, just silently waiting for a wounded U-boat to make a mistake. So incredibly anxious, Wolfram risks raising his thin attack periscope to scan the waves. He doesn't see anything, but that attack scope has one major glaring blind spot. It can't look up to check the sky for aircraft.
Now, what's really interesting about this is Wolfram's next move. It's a classic catch-22, and he makes a fateful split-second decision. He orders the crew to lower the thin attack periscope and instead raise the much larger, bulkier surveillance scope. Why? Well, the surveillance scope has a much higher angle of view, which perfectly lets him check the skies for enemy bombers. But it comes with a fatal flaw. Its massive head creates this huge, incredibly obvious wake in the water, basically giving away the submarine's position to anyone who happens to be looking closely at the surface. Wolfram is so completely fixated on the sky above that he entirely forgets to worry about what might be waiting for him in the icy depths below.
And wouldn't you know it, waiting quietly in those exact same waters is the British submarine HMS Venturer. Commanded by the incredibly sharp and highly analytical Lieutenant James Stewart Launders, Venturer is lurking beneath the waves, specifically tasked with intercepting enemy movements. Down in the dark, the British crew is on high alert, tense, and incredibly calculating.
Up in the Venturer's control room, the second in command, Lieutenant Andrew Chalmers, is straining his eyes at the periscope, just slowly sweeping it across the bleak, gray sea. And then suddenly, he spots it. I mean, he can probably hardly believe his luck. Right there, cutting a massive white scar through the water, is the unmistakable, bulky head of a German surveillance scope. Since he knows for a fact there are 0 Allied boats in this sector, Chalmers instantly realizes he's looking at the enemy. Pure adrenaline just electrifies the British crew. Chalmers immediately sends a sailor to wake Commander Launders. Launders rushes into the control room, takes one quick look through the scope, confirms the U-boat, and without missing a beat, orders his crew to ready the torpedoes. But you have to remember, the ocean down there is essentially a two-way mirror of sound. Over on U-864, the hydrophone operator suddenly gets a hit. Cutting right through the loud chugging noise of their own damaged engines is the very distinct, rhythmic thrum of HMS Venturer's propellers. The operator screams a desperate warning to the captain. Wolfram realizes instantly that he's being hunted. He throws the sub into evasive maneuvers, frantically zigzagging back and forth.
His goal here is to abruptly change his course every few minutes to break the tracking. He's hoping to make it mathematically impossible for the British to lock onto his position, all while still desperately trying to limp back to the safety of the Norwegian coast. Meanwhile, back on Venturer, Commander Launders takes another look and realizes his target is now actively zigzagging. You can imagine the frustration. Hitting a submerged enemy is already monumentally difficult, but hitting a submerged enemy that is actively zigging and zagging? That requires absolute mathematical perfection. Launders decides to play the long game. He shadows U-864, carefully matching its movements at a tense estimated range of about 2,500 yards. He needs to secretly gather enough accurate data, things like heading, speed, and the exact angle of those wild turns, so he can manually calculate a firing solution. So the crucial point is, how does Launders actually get this data while essentially flying blind? Well, remember that incredibly bulky surveillance periscope? And his overwhelming anxiety to monitor the skies, Wolfram has kept it raised right above the waves. It essentially becomes a giant, steady visual bullseye for the British commander. Just by watching the wake of that scope, Launders deduces the U-boat is crawling at a sluggish 3 knots. He figures out pretty quickly that he's probably dealing with a younger, inexperienced opponent. And that raised scope, that is exactly the fatal flaw he needs to crack the math. With a stopwatch in hand, Launders meticulously times every single zig and zag the German submarine makes. You can picture him, his pencil aggressively scratching away on the naval chart, while his entire crew just watches in this tense, breathless anticipation. And then finally, he sees the pattern. Launders realizes Wolfram is making exact, predictable 10-degree course zigzags. The puzzle pieces are finally coming together. The moment the U-boat zags back to starboard, Launders knows exactly where it's going to cross right in front of him. But here's the thing. He can't just fire one torpedo. The target is just moving too unpredictably for a single shot. He has to fire a spread of torpedoes at perfectly timed intervals to essentially trap the sub. With sweat literally dripping down his brow, Launders finalizes the exact timing. He sets his stopwatch to precisely 15 seconds. And then the waiting begins. It's absolutely agonizing as those seconds tick by across the ivory face of his watch. The exact moment arrives. Launders gives the historic command. Fire tube 1. The heavy torpedo bursts out of the tube, surging fiercely into the freezing sea. Launders instantly clicks his stopwatch, and that brutal 15-second countdown to the next shot begins right away. What happens next is basically a terrifying underwater ballet. Step 1. Over on U-864, the hydrophone operator hears it and screams, "Torpedo in the water!" Wolfram immediately orders a crash dive hard to starboard. The German crew desperately grips the railings as the floor just drops out from beneath them. And hey, the maneuver works. The first torpedo misses completely and violently smashes into the rocks of a nearby island. Step 2. Exactly 15 seconds later, Venturer fires tube 2. U-864 is still plunging deeper, and that second torpedo races harmlessly right over their heads. Step 3. Venturer fires tube 3. It's another miss, but Wolfram, he knows the drill. He knows his enemy likely only has 4 tubes ready to go. If he can dodge just one more, he'll have his own 4 torpedoes ready to fire right back. Step 4. Aboard Venturer, the tension is unbearable. This is Launders' absolute last chance for a direct hit before the Germans return fire. He gives the final order. Fire tube 4. That final torpedo launches, leaving a fast stream of bubbles as it streaks toward the plunging U-boat. Onboard U-864, they hear it coming. They frantically try to push the submarine even deeper into the sea, but it's just no use. The 4th torpedo violently strikes U-864 right amidships. The impact tears the incredibly thick steel hull completely open, unleashing a massive, immediate onslaught of pressurized water. In a matter of seconds, the flooded midsection becomes impossibly heavy, forcing the entire hull to just give way. The sheer, immense pressure rips the submarine into 3 distinct pieces. Wolfram and his crew honestly don't even have time to process what's happening before they're dragged down into the black depths. Back on the HMS Venturer, the British crew gathers quietly around the hydrophones. They listen intently as the horrific sounds of crashing, tearing metal, and violently rushing water slowly fade away into an eerie, absolute silence. They've just achieved something that everyone thought was impossible, a literal historical first in naval warfare. But you know, the mood on board is incredibly somber. Nobody is popping champagne or celebrating. Even though they successfully stopped a terrifying cargo from reaching Japan, they're acutely aware of the heavy human cost. 70 fellow sailors, enemies or not, have just met a truly terrifying end in the deep. And this brilliantly illustrates how the shadow of a historic battle extends way beyond 1945. For decades, the shattered wreck of U-864 just sat there quietly at the bottom of the sea. But remember that deadly top-secret cargo we talked about? Well, as time passed, those weapons began to rust and corrode. The highly poisonous chemicals they contained started leaking out, basically seeping into the sea and severely poisoning the local marine environment. It actually became such a massive ecological threat that in 2018, we're talking more than 70 years after the crew met their watery grave, the Norwegian government had to step in. They launched this massive, complex operation to bury the entire broken U-boat in a giant sarcophagus of sand and rocks, desperately trying to avert a total environmental catastrophe. And incredibly, that operation is still ongoing today.
Which really leaves us with a rather chilling realization. We can easily look at this explainer as just an incredible story of wartime tactics, complex geometry, and a historic naval first. But the remnants of that very battle are quite literally still poisoning our world today. So the historic underwater duel might be over, but it absolutely begs a question. As we continue to map out the oceans of our world, how many other toxic secrets born out of mankind's greatest conflicts are still sitting silently in the dark depths, just waiting for us to find them?